Dynamic range is a term that's used to describe a quality, a characteristic of a harmonica. One of many characteristics, one of many things that we look for in a well-playing harmonica. So to explain what is dynamic range, I made up this model. So before we go any further, you're going to say, well, what's a model? What are you talking about? Well, I found a definition for a model. It's a hypothetical or stylized representation. Another definition is a generalized hypothetical description, often based on analogy, used in analyzing or explaining something. For this video, let's just call a model a tool used to explain something. One of the things we're going to be talking about is flow. So flow is a measurable value that correlates with the amount of breath force applied to a harmonica. So for all intents and purposes, I'm going to talk about flow, but when I mention flow, I'm talking about breath force. Okay, so we play hard, we play soft. Dynamic range, quite plain and simple, it's the minimum and maximum breath force that can make a harmonica reed play. So if you have a harmonica that responds to light breath force, you don't have to use a lot of flow. And if you have one that responds to hard breath force, it doesn't jam up. So here's the model. It's a bunch of arrows on a page. Let me just give you a description of what we're talking about here. So this is the range, the dynamic range of the harmonica. So we have flow on this axis, and right in the middle, that's sort of medium breath force. So you can blow pretty hard on this dynamic range. You can blow pretty hard before the reed jams up. Okay, and likewise, you can play pretty softly below medium, and the reed will still respond. If you play with lower breath than the minimum that will make it go, you'll feel that the reed is sluggish, or it requires more breath. It's hard work to get the reed to move. You have to use more breath to get the reed to move. Okay, so that's a bit of an explanation of dynamic range. What do we have here? Well, this is an incredibly large dynamic range. This is our ideal, our perfect scenario, our best of the best harmonica. You know, you could play really, really softly, you could play really, really hard, and the reeds respond. There's no hesitation. We all talk about that 1 in 20 harmonicas that we get off the shelf, out of the box. They play really great. One of the reasons they play really great is they have a great dynamic range. So this is huge. This is the really good harmonica, the one you put a little sticker or a little asterisk on your favorite harp, basically, in your case. This one is okay. So there's a little bit of a little bit smaller dynamic range. Still, from medium, you could play pretty softly. You could play fairly hard, and that's your run-of-the-mill, out-of-the-box harmonica. Okay, so most harps you're going to get are going to have this much maximum dynamic range. You still see that if you want to play, you know, those 3-draw half-step bends with gentle breath, they won't come out. You need to work a bit harder to get those delicate notes to come through. And likewise, if you play too hard, the notes will lock up. Okay, so we're going to throw reed shape, we're going to throw gapping in the mix, and we're going to see what that does to dynamic range. Okay, so let's take an example here where we have normal, okay, pretty good reed shape. We're going to look at the gaps. So this is a medium, this is a, you know, middle of the road, you know, where the gap should be to get everything to respond. And we have a great harp. We have a wonderful harp. It plays well. It's that 1 in 10. But let's say you're a hard player and you really want to hit the notes hard, right? So you gap it. If you gapped it just a little bit tighter, this range would just shift up a little bit. But you went to the max. You went as high as you could possibly get the gap, and now you're at a point of diminishing returns. Why is that? Well, yes, the peak flow has gone up. You can play harder without the reed locking up, but the low end of the harp, the minimal flow that it takes to get the harp to respond, has gone up higher than this has gone up. Basically, our dynamic range is this arrow. These arrows this is a smaller arrow, right? If we count the spaces, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 lines long. This one is 1, 2, 3, 4.5 lines long. So by increasing the gap dramatically, we've increased the upper dynamic range, but we've lost some ground on the low end. So if you play this harp with anything but medium breath force, maybe a little bit softer than medium breath force, but any softer than that, the notes just don't respond. Okay? Likewise, let's say you like a harp that responds really well, and you tighten the gap to as far as it'll go. You're going to get that improvement on the low end here, but again, you have diminishing returns. You've lost more ground. You can't get this harp to play with anything harder than medium breath force. Very frustrating to play when your notes lock up as soon as you start to play with some intensity. So to recap, if you make a small change in the gap, you can maintain the size of this arrow, the size of the dynamic range. But if you do extreme gapping, the limitation is you lose range. You lose out. Your reed doesn't respond anymore. Okay, let's throw reed shape into the mix. So on this reed, airflow, one unit of airflow will make the reed move, right? In this example, let's say we have a reed that's just a little bit poorly shaped. It's a little bit more aerodynamic, so air will flow around it. So instead of 1 arrow's worth of flow, we need 2. We need more flow to get the reed to move. Okay, so what does that mean? Well, let's say it comes out of the box, middle of the road gapped. We need more air for the reed to start to move. So it's on that low end, those delicate, when you want to hit those draw bends with delicate precision, doesn't come in. You're going to need to hit it harder. If you want the reeds to play with normal breath force, the air is going to flow around the reed. So you're going to think, this reed is stiff. This reed doesn't want to cooperate. Well, it's not stiff. It's aerodynamic. Air is flowing around it. So our dynamic range is reduced. We can still hit it with the same hard breath force as a normal reed, but it's that low end of the dynamic range that we've chopped off, that we've gotten rid of because the reed shape is bad. So let's say you want to improve this harmonica. Well, you'll lower the gap. So we've gone from here, we've tightened things up. Now our dynamic range is centered right on the midpoint, medium breath force, and we got some low end response, some soft breath force, and we have hard breath force response. This is your typical, same as over here, your typical, can't see that. This is your average out of the box harmonica. They don't have perfectly shaped reeds, and this is what you get. That's what your dynamic range looks like. Okay. That's what your dynamic range looks like. Again, if you want more precision on soft breath force, especially to get those half-step bends to come in on the lower end, you lower your gaps and look at the dramatic response. This stiff reed, it's not really stiff, it's aerodynamic, but we've lowered the gap so much that the reed is almost just closed. So to get it to sound, to get it to sound at low breath force, you have to close down the gap so much that you don't have anything other than medium breath force. Anything above medium breath force causes this reed to lock up. Likewise, if you want to play this reed hard, you're going to raise that gap up. Well, with all the air that's rushing through here and the high gap, forget about playing with soft breath force. You need to play medium breath or higher to get this reed to respond. Okay, so that's what you're getting. So let's take a look at what we can do. So we have this scenario here. We've optimized our bad reed. I've made a different picture of a bad reed. This bad reed, the middle of the reed dips in first, but it's still allowing air to come in through the side. So we have that reduced dynamic range with gapped so that the medium breath force is right in the middle. What happens if I keep the same gap, but I fix the reed shape, so now the reed doesn't dip in the middle anymore? Well, look what happens. My dynamic range is extended. This arrow is significantly longer than this arrow. I've made my reed more efficient, and I have more dynamic range. So now my low breath force actually makes the reed work. Now this is a bit closely gapped to begin with, so my dynamic range on the top here, I can't play it with a lot of force. So what are we going to do? We're going to open that gap. We're going to push that gap up. This brings the dynamic range up to here. The midpoint is at medium, and we have low response, we have high response. We now have a better than stock reed. This is your 1 in 10 harmonica, 1 in 20 amazing harmonica, because now you've got a bigger dynamic range by correcting the reed shape, and you've optimized your gaps. So I hope this sort of illustrates that gapping can only do so much. Gapping can personalize your breath force, your dynamic range, but there's a point of diminishing returns. It can't do everything. You combine fixing reed shape and gap, then you can really see some potential. So this is one reed. These are all examples of one reed, but we know that in a harmonica chamber there's two reeds that work together. Now what does that look like? Well, this would never mind about reed shape. This gap now is not the gap of the reed that we're working on, it's the opposite reed's gap. So let's say I'm working on the draw reed, and this is my blow gap. So this is my dynamic range, so it's not terribly good, not terribly bad, it's sort of run-of-the-mill average. If I lower the blow reed's gap, right, let's never mind about the dynamic reed of the blow reed, but look what I've gained. I gained some low-end dynamic range on the draw reed because things are tighter. Air is not escaping from the blow reed as much anymore, so that goes to contribute to my low end and extends my arrow. It makes my dynamic range bigger for the draw reed. And likewise, if my blow reed, if I raise the gap really hard, I want to play that blow reed really hard, doesn't really change the how hardly I can draw on the draw reed, but I've lost ground on how softly I can inhale on my draw reed, because my airflow as I breathe softly below this threshold is escaping through this gap through the blow reed. This is the opposite gap. Okay, so I hope this has illustrated a little bit of what I mean and what is meant by dynamic range. A lot of folks will say, well, you don't need a custom harp because this is enough. You should be able to do anything little Walter did with this much dynamic range. Yes and no. I mean, a lot of folks will assume that a custom harp means you go from this to this. It's really tight, really responsive on the bottom end, but no top end. That's not so. That's not so. A custom harp really is better than this. Really, a custom harp is somewhere in between this dynamic range and this dynamic range. Customizing a harp will give you more ability to play the notes softly and retain the ability, if not extend the ability, to play hard notes. Now, an overblow harp, yes, an overblow harp probably will have a really nice dynamic range, but will be sort of lowered. The middle point will be lower because you want everything to be even. You want the overblows to play with as much force as the the blow notes and the draw notes and the bent notes. You want everything to be equal, and the only way you can do that is to center things a little bit lower. So no, you're not going to have, an overblow harp is not going to have the same dynamic range, but that's a different thing. An overblow harp is a specialized custom harp. It's specialized for one purpose, and that's not what we're talking about. So I really hope that defining dynamic range for you, explaining it, showing you this model, really helps you put together what gapping does, what reed shape does, and how that all collaborates to making your harps play really, really well.